everybody. I'm Howard Tiersky, and welcome once again to the Winning Digital Customer Show. Well, space is in the news this week for a couple of reasons that I want to talk about today and talk about what it means for you as a leader of innovation, digital, and digital transformation at your company. So, interestingly, within seemingly a few days of each other, two of our most successful sort of digital era billionaires, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, both rocketed into space on their own rockets. Isn't it nice to have enough money to be able to buy your own rocket? And so both of them, thankfully, went up into space and came safely down to Earth. And in both cases, this is a step closer to commercialized space travel. In the case of Elon Musk and SpaceX, they're looking to eventually be able to send people to Mars. And Jeff Bezos's Blue Origin space company also moving more towards commercialized space flight through this successful test of their rocket technology. And of course, for as a perk of their leadership in these areas, they both got the opportunity to travel themselves as astronauts into space. So cool. But actually, there's also something going on this week that's I would say, equally important thing to remember in our manned space history, which is that this yesterday, actually, July 20th, was the 52nd anniversary of the Apollo 11 landing on the moon, the first manned spacecraft to land on the lunar surface, and obviously with astronauts who walked on the lunar surface. A major accomplishment for all of humanity after, no doubt, hundreds of millions of years of people gazing at the moon. To actually be able to go there was a major step forward. Obviously, as Neil Armstrong said, one small step for man, one giant step for mankind. And so I think it's important that we honor that. It's always easy for me to remember how many years it's been since the first lunar landing, because I was actually born only about 5 months before the first lunar landing. So I'm 52, and the lunar landing was 52 years ago. It always works out that way. So I have a helpful way myself of remembering. And you could do the same thing, by the way. Just any year you want to know how many years it's been since the lunar landing, just think, well, how old is Howard? And if you know how old I am, then you know how many years it's been since the lunar landing. In any case, let's spend a few minutes talking about some of the things that we can learn from this massive success for humanity. I always believe that, look, we undertake challenging things in our companies all the time, and it's easy to see all the problems. But when somebody's been successful, one of my mentors and a major influence on my life has been Tony Robbins, and he has said many times, success leaves clues. And so I always like to take a look at the question of, when we see something that's successful, what can we learn from it? So the moon landing, of course, was probably one of the largest innovation and transformational undertakings in all of human history. There were more than 400,000 people who worked on putting those men on the moon through all the different construction of all the things that had to be done and all the tests and trials and NASA and mission control, and put all those people together, both government employees and contractors, over 400,000 people. So is your ambitious undertaking at your company of that magnitude? Are you trying to do something as big as going to the moon? Or are you just trying to completely transform your industry? All of a sudden, it doesn't seem quite so overwhelming. So realize that whatever you're undertaking, it's probably not as ambitious and giant of an undertaking, no matter how big it seems, as putting a man on the moon. So whatever we can learn from how they did that has at least the possibility of being applicable. So I'm going to run through quickly 10 things that I think we can all learn from the story of the successful lunar program. So the first is, be willing to shoot for something that's truly bold. The word lunatic, there's different theories about the origin of the word lunatic, but one theory of the origin of the word lunatic is that the word originally described people that were crazy enough to think that man could go to the moon. Of course, the word lunatic has the origin, the word, the luna word part. What is that? A suffix or a prefix or whatever? It's been too long since I studied for the SAT to remember, but whether it's from Latin or whatever it meant, obviously the word luna means loon, as in lunar surface. So lunatic, somebody who was crazy enough to think that there was actually a way to get to the moon. So there's a great expression that says something like all ideas start out as crazy and then become something that seems possible and eventually something that seems obvious, like it was always there all along. And so today, of course, we don't think of going to the moon as anything that is in any way crazy. We know that it's been done a number of times, but there was a time when the whole notion to even speak something out loud that you thought that you could put a human being on the surface of the moon made you sound like you are absolutely insane. But you know what? Look at all the things that we have today. Who would have thought that it would be insane to think that you could, have a video conference on your watch? I mean, that was something we saw in Dick Tracy in the cartoons years ago, but nobody thought that that was something that you could actually do. Who would have thought that you would have the ability to be connected to people wherever you go? Who would have thought that we'd have the ability to push one button on our phone and call a taxi cab or pay people with an electronic device in our pockets? So many things that we do today not too long ago would have seemed crazy. And so when you have a vision of something that you want to pursue, you see an opportunity, don't be afraid of the possibility that others will make fun of you, like on the schoolyard, for having a big idea, call you a lunatic. If they call you a lunatic, wear that as a badge of pride, because that's what we called people who had a vision to think that a man could be put on the moon. You could argue that John F. Kennedy was one of our, one of the lunatics who made it possible. So number one of my quick 10 things we can learn from the lunar program, number one was don't be afraid of being a lunatic. Number two is to communicate a bold, clear vision. One of the things that really launched the space program to go to the moon, the Apollo program, was Kennedy standing in front of the country and being willing to be a lunatic, but not just to be thinking it, but to communicate a clear, bold vision with a clear goal. And he said in 1961, it should be a national goal to send an American to the moon before the end of the decade and return him safely to Earth. So very specific, right? A date to accomplish it, a specific, clear goal. He wasn't just saying it's important that we do more to explore space. We need to try to get man to the moon. He defined a clear objective and a clear time frame for it. So I would encourage you to think the same way. And you know what? Did Kennedy know for sure that this could be accomplished by the end of the decade? I would strongly guess no. But he knew that creating a timeline and creating a bold goal was going to be something that was going to mobilize and inspire people. And in fact, that is exactly what happened. So that's number two, communicate a bold and clear vision. Let's move on. Number three, it helps to have an enemy. An enemy. Why? What do I mean by that? Well, one of the things that got Kennedy mobilized and got the American people mobilized around this program was the fact that, remember I said Kennedy made that speech in 1961. Well, earlier in 1961, in April of 1961, the Soviet Union's Sputnik program landed Yuri Gagarin as the first human in space. So when the Soviets, our main rivals in world geopolitics at that time, were ahead of us in what we call the space race, there was this feeling that not only was this an inspiring goal for us, but it's something we needed to do to beat the other guys. And of course, we see in all kinds of arenas, whether it's sports or politics or other areas, people get mobilized when they feel there's an enemy. So there's downsides to encouraging people to think negatively about other people, other companies. But in this case, there's no doubt that when you feel there's an enemy, hopefully it's not an enemy that you hate, but a rival that you're committed to surpassing, that helps you raise your own standards and demand more of yourself, and also prove to you what's possible. When you see that somebody else is racing towards a goal, you tend to focus less on whether it's actually possible and more simply how you can beat the other person or the other team or the other company or the other country. So tip number three that we can learn from the space race, from the Apollo program, it helps to have an enemy. Tip number four, iterate. You notice that the mission that landed on the surface of the moon was not called Apollo 1, not Apollo 1, Apollo 11. They were in the double digits of the Apollo mission before they actually landed what would you call it? It's not a rocket, whatever they landed, the lander. They landed the lander. It's before they landed a craft on the surface of the moon. It was a process of iteration. In the digital world, we often refer to this as the minimum viable product. How do you bring a first early version to market and then improve it, iterate it? The first version you bring to market may not fulfill your entire vision. It may not even really fulfill the main aspect of your vision, but you want to think about how do you iterate to success? That's what every successful digital company has done. In the Apollo case, the first seven the first five Apollo missions were completely unmanned. Number 6 and 7 didn't go to the moon. It was only Apollo 8 where they finally had an astronaut in a spacecraft orbiting the moon, and that had no lunar landing. That was simply sending a craft that could go up, orbit the moon, and then come back. Was that fulfilling Kennedy's vision? No, it was not. But it was an important step along the way to prove out certain things, to continue to improve and work the kinks out to get to the point where they could fulfill the complete mission. And then Apollo 9 didn't even go to the moon, was orbiting the Earth. Apollo 10 again went back to the moon and orbited the moon. They did everything but land on the moon. Can you imagine doing everything in your product except the one thing that defines success? Sometimes you have to be willing to do that. You have to be willing to take step by step and iterate to the point that you achieve your final goal. And that is why it took till Apollo 11 to finally land on the moon. So that's step number 4, iterate your way to success. Tip number 5, divide and conquer. Sometimes a problem can seem so overwhelming. How on earth would we create a rocket that could go to the moon? It's got to get there. It's got to get in orbit. It's got to land on the moon. It's got to get back up off the moon. It's got to get back to Earth. It's got to land back on Earth. How do you create something that can do all of those things? Well, the answer is they didn't. The spacecraft, plural, used for the moon missions were, first of all, just the rocket that would lift them off the Earth was in 3 separate stages built by different companies, right? And then they had the part that orbited, then they had a different part that would land on the moon and get them back up and back into orbit, and then a different rocket that would send them back to Earth. So they broke the problem into pieces. And not only did they break it into pieces conceptually, but they assigned the different parts of the problem to different teams. So they were able to break it up and say, okay, someone's just got to focus on getting them up off the Earth. Just that. Don't worry about anything else. Just get them up off the Earth. Someone else is going to figure out, assuming we get to the point that we're in orbit of the moon, around the moon, how are we going to get them from there to landing on the ground? That team, don't you worry about how we're going to get them into orbit around the moon. Someone else is going to figure that out. You just figure out, assuming we can do that, how to get them to land on the ground. So this is very powerful. When you divide a problem into pieces and you say, if I can solve all 5 of these pieces and connect them together, I'll have a successful result. And now each of those pieces, while still a sizable undertaking, at least feels like something where you know where to start. It's something that you can focus on and accomplish instead of something that's overwhelming. So that's tip number 5. We're halfway there. Can you believe it? Divide and conquer. Break a problem into pieces, and if necessary, use separate teams or even separate companies or separate partners. Number 6, something I talk about all the time. Test, prototype, and test with users. One of the key components as they broke apart all the different problems they had to solve for the Apollo program was the spacesuits. They knew, of course, that the astronauts wouldn't be able to probably survive even in the spacecraft without protective gear, let alone be able to walk on the surface of the moon where it's super cold and there's not much oxygen and et cetera, et cetera. So they knew that some kind of special space suit was going to be essential. And so what NASA actually did is they let a whole bunch of different companies come to them with proposals and prototypes for what that spacesuit might look like. They awarded contracts to a couple of companies. Those companies created the first round of spacesuits. Then they tested them. They tested them with astronauts. They tested them with simulated situations. And you know what? They didn't work. And NASA had to go back to the drawing board and work again on how to figure out how to make the spacesuits. Eventually, they created several different types of spacesuits for different missions, different spacesuits for walking on the surface versus when they're in the command module, et cetera. But the point is, the way they figured it out was by having different teams work on different prototypes, testing them in controlled situations with the real users and figuring out what was going to work, what wasn't going to work, what had to be thrown away, when they had to start again. And only through that process of trial and error, working with the actual astronauts, were they able to get to spacesuits that would allow them to work. And by the way, not only did they do it with the actual astronauts, but they were very mindful of what do the astronauts need to be able to do in the spacesuits. For example, they needed to be able to climb a ladder So that meant that there needed to be enough flexibility in the legs that they could actually be able to do that. They needed to be able to bend over to pick up samples and whatever else it was that was part of the mission. So making sure that they had users testing the spacesuits in doing the tasks they'd have to do. So that's exactly what you have to do with your product. If you're launching an app, you want to prototype that app. You want to have users say, hey, this is a shopping app. Go through the prototype and try to buy a product. It's not going to be perfect. After all, they weren't testing the spacesuits on the moon. So it wasn't 100% completely accurate simulation, but it let them see where there were problems. Simulate not only the solution, but simulate the activities with real users to get a sense of what works and what doesn't work and needs to be rethought, and be willing to rethink your prototypes. It's a heck of a lot cheaper to redo your prototype than it is to completely build something out and have it not work. And obviously, it would have been tragic if they'd actually sent astronauts into space in spacesuits that didn't work, and which could cause, obviously, death or failure of a mission. So that was tip number 6. Tip number 7, not only do you need to understand the users, but you need to understand the environment in which your product is going to be used. In the case of the lunar rover, sort of the type of car, dune buggy type thing that the astronauts drove around the moon on. Doesn't that sound super fun, by the way, to get to drive around in not zero gravity, but whatever it is, low gravity on the surface of the moon? Super cool. But, they also knew that they couldn't just send a Volkswagen Beetle for them to drive around on the surface of the moon, right? That would have worked here, but that wouldn't have worked there for multiple reasons. For one thing, there wasn't a lot of gravity, and a vehicle is propelled forward by its wheels. Well, if the wheels don't have solid contact with the ground, because the whole thing doesn't weigh a lot, and by the way, they couldn't make it weigh too much because everything that had to be sent up by the rocket, every pound of weight, of mass, affected the amount of thrust that they needed. So they needed things to be light, and at the same time, if a vehicle isn't heavy in a low gravity environment, and the wheels could just be spinning and not going anywhere because they're not solidly on the ground, if you can follow that. So there was very specific environmental things that they needed to think about. And ultimately they created these special wheels that kind of grip the ground with this wire mesh. They knew that the surface of the moon was covered with this sort of dust, and so they created these wheels that sort of used the dust that was on the surface of the moon to get into the mesh that was around the wheels, so they would be able to get enough grabbing of the ground, enough traction, so that they could use the wheel motion to actually pull the rover, the vehicle, forward, if that makes sense to you. So what does this have to do with whatever digital products that you may be creating? Well, if your app is going to be used in bright sunlight, if your app is going to be used by people who are older or may have disabilities, if it's going to be used on different size devices, you need to take all this into consideration. If you're creating something that's going to be used in a loud and noisy environment, you better not rely too much on audio. You want to make sure you're testing not only the users, but you're really thinking about where and how and what kind of devices and in what kind of situations and in what kind of environments, in what kind of countries, in what kind of connectivity. For example, if you have an app that allows a salesperson to take an order when they go out to someone's home to sell, let's say, insurance, well, what if there's no internet connectivity? Right? Just like there's little or limited internet connectivity, just like there's limited gravity on the moon. You need to think about those environmental situations. Maybe you need to create an app that can work offline, so the order can be fully taken, even if the credit card can't be processed, but they can complete the process instead of sitting there at the dining room table with somebody and sort of being out of luck because you can't really sell because you don't have internet connectivity, just as an example. So there are a lot of environmental considerations and any kind of digital solution that you need to take into consideration, just like the space program had to think about the environment of the moon. Okay, let's go to number 8. Oh, we're almost home, guys. Number 8, be resourceful and be ready to build things yourself. Because they were breaking new ground, because so many of the problems they needed to solve for the Apollo program, the size of the rocket they needed, the food that they needed so that astronauts could eat in space, the kind of networking and data communications that they needed between the spaceship and the Earth. We just talked about the need to have a car that can be driven on the moon. In many cases, what they needed was not commercially available. They had to create it. When you're innovating, you may find, if you're copycatting, if you're doing things others have done, you may be able to go out there and find solutions that you can just use out of the box or adapt in a minor way. But if you're innovating, as they were, you may need to be prepared to create stuff yourself. Don't do it if you don't need to. but be mindful of the fact that that's okay. And if you look at many of the largest, most successful digital companies in the world, many of them create their own software. Many of them are not using the kind of prepackaged software tools that more modest digital efforts use. So I'm not saying, of course, don't use any outside products, not at all, but just be mindful that you shouldn't be constrained and limited by what's available in the commercial market. And just as an example, the memory that was used in the computers for the ships for the Apollo 11, they needed memory that would be have a certain capacity for the onboard computers, but also had to be light, because the reason I talked about before, because every ounce of weight meant they needed that much more thrust and created more challenges to the mission. And so they had to use a kind of exotic type of memory, which was called a core rope memory, and it was made of very thin wires. And there was no way to have it commercially made. The only way it could be made was with a needle. It was essentially woven with copper thread, basically, the way one would weave a textile. So they had hundreds of textile workers working for months using a needle and thread to weave this old-fashioned type of memory together so they would have the type of memory that they needed. So you need to be prepared if you need to cook something up yourself to solve a problem if you're innovating. Okay, number 9, train the people. Now, this seems obvious when you're sending astronauts in space, and the Apollo 11 crew underwent all kinds of training and simulation, making sure they knew how to use the equipment, understanding exactly what they would need to do as astronauts to make the mission successful. It wasn't only about the rockets, it wasn't only about the computers, it wasn't only about the dune buggy and the rover. It was ultimately about what the people would be able to do. In the digital world, we can sometimes forget that the people still may be the most important part, or even if they're not the most important part, they're a key part. What does your call center need to do differently when you update your app? What kind of back-end human processes do you need to be put in place, from accounting to legal to customer service and beyond? What processes do you need from a technology and a business design, user experience design perspective? What do you need to do to make sure the people know how to do what they need to do, that you're not only thinking about digital transformation as something that happens with bits and bytes? So thinking about making sure you're really focused on the people is something that they, of course, were doing with the astronauts, and something that we need to make sure that we don't lose focus on while we're focusing on all these other cool, digital and technology components. And number 10, and there's more, by the way, but I'm only going to give you 10 today. So much to be learned from something like this. And there's many great books, by the way, on the history, if you will, of what they went through in order to be able to get this program to be a massive success. But number 10 is quality assurance. Making sure, especially when you're doing something new and innovative, that you're taking the time to put the expertise in place to make sure that what you're doing will really work. I talk in my book, Winning Digital Customers, The Antidote to Irrelevance, the 3 main reasons new products fail. And one of them is the wrong concept, a product concept that people just don't want. And one of them is lack of awareness. You have something great and you failed to get the market to be aware of it. But the third is failure to execute. You had the right vision, but somehow between the idea and the actual thing that you built, it just didn't come together in the right way. The classic example would be the Galaxy Note 7, Samsung Galaxy Note 7, right? Most popular smartphone ever launched at the time it was launched. But, all of a sudden the battery started catching on fire. And the next thing you know, Samsung's stock price had dropped by a number of billions of dollars because they had to do one of the largest recalls in history. Obviously, you don't want those kinds of problems. Clearly, on something like the lunar mission, a very public and human lives were at stake. They wanted to make sure that everything went right. And so one of the final components of the mission were the parachutes that would deploy from the command module when that last little bit, after they discarded everything else, they didn't have the rover anymore, they didn't have the lander anymore, they didn't have the rockets anymore. All that was left was that little tiny capsule that had to splash down into the ocean, and the parachutes that would make sure that that capsule was sufficiently slowed, because, of course, it was coming down through the atmosphere at fantastic speed. And those parachutes were key to make sure it was slowed to a slow enough rate that it could hit the ocean safely and the astronauts. Because don't forget, a key part of Kennedy's vision, short though it was, return them safely to Earth. Of course, they were actually returned to the sea, but then they got in a ship and were safely on land. Maybe Earth counts. Maybe the sea counts as Earth anyway. I'm not sure. But the point is, each of those parachutes was 7,200 square feet of fabric. They were enormous, they were large enough. Each parachute was large enough to cover all of the floor space in a typical American home. And they had 3 parachutes. And the parachutes were made of 3.5 miles of thread over 2 million individual stitches. And here's the thing. Even one bad stitch that wouldn't hold during the landing, it was feared could cause failure. They needed all 3 parachutes. If a stitch failed in a parachute and a seam started opening up with the tremendous force of air that those parachutes had to sort of hold back, it could start a seam ripping, and that whole seam could rip, and that parachute could go, and then that could mean the other 2 parachutes weren't strong enough, and they could go. And it was critical that every stitch be right. And so they had a light table. And not only did they have to do 2 million stitches, but they had a quality assurance process where every one of those stitches was studied and signed off on a light table, looking at that fabric to make sure that that stitch was in right. And then they had people specially trained to pack the parachutes to make sure they would unfold correctly. And there were only 3 people that they certified that were fully qualified to pack the parachutes, to fold them up, so to make sure that when they were released, they would actually unfold and deploy properly and not get tangled. And those same 3 people handled all of the Apollo 11 missions, or all of the Apollo missions. So again, great care to make sure that there was quality assurance, that all of these great things that they envisioned were executed thoroughly and no mistakes were made. Now, of course, your digital transformation may not have quite as low of a risk tolerance as the Apollo missions did, because one false move, you could have dead astronauts in a failed mission. And clearly that was not what the American people and the whole world was watching. But very often that issue of failure to execute can be a huge problem. You have the right idea for an app, but you just don't do enough user testing. You just don't do enough performance testing. It's just not quite where you need it to be. And frankly, today's customers have tremendously high expectations for the quality of the digital experiences that they use. And they will quickly abandon something, even if it's 98% great, if it's too slow, or if it's confusing, or if it's glitchy, or things like that. So, and of course, like we talked about earlier, you need to make sure you understand the needs of the users. You need to make sure you understand the environment it's going to be used in, to make sure you are delivering something that will be flawless in their hands when they're using it. That is what the Apollo 11 mission needed. They needed flawless, because think how many things could have gone wrong on the Apollo 11 mission and caused it to fail. If the launch hadn't happened correctly, if they hadn't navigated correctly, if they hadn't gotten into a stable orbit, if they hadn't been able to deploy the lander, if they hadn't landed successfully on the moon, if they'd had a problem with their spacesuits, if there a problem with their communications, with their computers, if they hadn't been able to fire the rockets to head back to Earth, if there'd been a problem with the parachutes. I mean, the number of possible problems that could, and any one of those, it doesn't take multiple, any one of those things, if it had failed, would have killed the mission and possibly killed the astronauts. And I hate to say it, but in a digital journey today, you have almost as high of a threshold for risk and tolerance of failure. Many, many things have to go right for someone to go to your website and, let's just say, find a product, put it in the shopping cart, calculate the sales tax, calculate the shipping, make sure you have it correct, whether the product is in stock or not, make sure you have an easy to use checkout process, take the order, fulfill it, pick and pack, send it to the person, make sure it's the right product in the box. I mean, there's so many things, any one of which, if it goes wrong, not only kills the sale, but potentially disappoints the customer in a way that could impact them in terms of their future interest in doing business. So many opportunities to screw up, and that's could be depressing, but I think it's overcomable as long as you have the kind of mindset that they had on Apollo 11 around quality and making sure that you're taking the time and care to not have those problems be there and doing everything you can. And of course, if you do have problems, that you see them and find them quickly and you solve them and fix them as soon as you can. Because unlike the Apollo 11 mission, where they only had one chance, right? If it didn't work, the entire mission was ruined, millions and millions of dollars lost, astronauts' lives lost. The good news is most digital projects are very, very different in that one regard from the Apollo 11 mission, which is every day, every customer, you have another opportunity. If your parachute stitch fails with a customer as they go to check out today, that's sad because you lost a sale. But as long as you're continuing to monitor it and you see and understand what happened and fix that problem going forward, you have an opportunity to iterate not just through prototypes to get to the live final production version, but you have an opportunity that is not as easy to do in the real world, and certainly not as easy to do in space missions, which is to iterate it continuously every day. So I would say that's your number 11. It's not something they were really able to do. Of course, they did have a series of different Apollo missions, and so that was kind of an example that a number of times they went to the moon. But ultimately, you have the opportunity to do that continuously, every day, every hour, every customer. And that's one big difference, and I want to encourage you to make sure that you're taking advantage of that as well, learning everything we can from what is similar about these missions, these space missions, and of course, taking advantage of the opportunities we have that they did not have. So those are my remarks for today. Happy anniversary of both the landing of the Apollo 11, human man on the moon mission, and of course, congratulations to Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, not just to them personally for their opportunity, their cool opportunity to go to space, but for their whole teams for being able to successfully send their rockets to space. Can you imagine how nervous you'd be sending your boss, the CEO of your company, to space in a rocket? Another example where you really don't want anything to go wrong. And thankfully, they also accomplished that objective. So congratulations to them. Thank you guys, as always, for watching and listening. I always appreciate your comments. Be sure to subscribe and follow, whether you're on YouTube or Facebook or LinkedIn or wherever you are. Make sure you see all the episodes of the live cast. Thanks for watching. Look forward to seeing you next time. And as always, keep transforming.